You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Peace to the pro-Black perspectives, and he finally got a notification. Peace, fam. Yeah, YouTube does some strange stuff. Oftentimes when the revolutionary matron and others go on live, I don't get a notification. It's real strange. Well, I want to thank everyone who's here with me tonight. Thanks to the Pro-Black Perspective for being here. I want to remind you guys that this show is part of a podcast network called KWAZ Network. KWAZ Radio, which is a podcast network. The other shows on the network you guys should be tuning into.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the Revolutionary Matron on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Make sure you guys check out all those shows on KWAZ Radio. In the chat, I see we also have the Revolutionary Matron from the Learning Curve podcast saying greetings, Jambo Indugu. You guys make sure the Learning Curve is here, the Pro-Black Perspective is here. Make sure to check out their shows. Pro-Black Perspective with Onitase. He just returned from the continent, from Ghana specifically, and he was regaling us with his time on the continent. You should check out his last episode for sure. The Revolutionary Matron recently did a episode with Rock Soldier. You guys should definitely check out not only the last episode she did with Rock Soldier, but the one before that. Real deep, emotional type stuff. There's a lot to learn from those episodes. All right. With that said, I present to you tonight this paper on African gods in the Americas, the Black Religious Continuum, a paper by Sheila S. Walker. This was in the Black Scholar Journal. It says, our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness. Whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness, entirely different. We may go through life without suspecting their existence, but apply the requisite stimulus, and at a touch they are there in all their completeness. Definite types of mentality, which probably somewhere have their field of application and adaptation. No account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness quite disregarded. How to regard them is the question, for they are so discontinuous with our ordinary consciousness, yet they may determine attitudes, though they cannot furnish formulas and open a region, though they fail to give a map. At any rate, they forbid a premature closing of our accounts with reality. Each society selects a certain spectrum of human experiential possibilities to elaborate and institutionalize, leaving outside the spectrum and sometimes defining as abnormal experiential possibilities institutionalized elsewhere. Some societies or segments thereof allow for a broad range of human expression. Others a more restricted range. What is acceptable, even desirable, in one social grouping may not be tolerated in another. One behavioral manifestation to which no society is indifferent is the phenomenon known as quote-unquote spirit possession, a state in which control of a person's behavior is believed to have been assumed by a spiritual entity that entered into the person's body. The phenomenon exists in some form in most parts of the world and is given different meanings by different social groups. In most of Western society, it is considered aberrant behavior that must be overcome, since the individuals possessed by spirits do not behave in their usual socially prescribed, controlled fashion. Witness the expression, quote, "what got into you," end of quote, and "what possessed you," referring to inexplicably uncharacteristic behavior, which is accounted for by saying that the person was not his or herself, suggesting that an external entity had assumed control of the individual's behavior. Within the realm of the Christian church, most spirit possession is viewed as demonic and to be overcome, sometimes necessitating the services of a professionally trained exorcist. In contrast, in some societies, spirit possession is a highly approved way of experiencing a very meaningful and different reality known to exist beyond the usual limits of human consciousness. In these societies, the entering of a spiritual being into the body of a devotee is a supreme act of religious worship. Such is the case in many African societies, particularly those of the Gulf of Benin area, from which the ancestors of the large majority of Black people in the Americas came. In the Yoruba and Fon societies of what are now the states of Nigeria and Benin, each supernatural being in the pantheon is worshipped in a ceremony in which he or she descends to earth to manifest him or herself in the persons of the cult of devotees. When Africans were brought to the Americas as slaves, they were forced to leave behind many of their cultural and social institutions and to adjust to a new system in which they could exercise little control over their lives. However, a major element of that culture that they succeeded in perpetuating was their religion. In spite of the distance and the radically changed social environment in which the Africans found themselves, their deities remained with them, and the new Afro-Americans continued to try to worship them in the same way in which they had worshipped them in Africa. An analysis of the religious continuum from the Gulf of Benin area to some of the major Black societies of the Americas makes apparent the various forms African religious structures, styles, and attitudes have taken as the result of varying socio-historical circumstances. A common unifying feature that manifests itself in differing ways along this continuum is the existence of spirit possession as a supreme religious act expressing the fundamental nature of the relationship between human beings and deities. I'm curious, for you guys who are listening, how many of you have been spiritually possessed before? And what was that like? Or B, how many of you have witnessed a spiritual possession of someone you know, or someone you were around? And what were your immediate feelings about what you were witnessing? Because when I grew up in the church as a kid, it was kind of like this paper just said, it was pretty much frowned upon to see someone filled with the Spirit, based on the kind of church that I grew up in, which was the Anglican church, right? It was kind of like you kind of side-eyed a person for all that quote-unquote carrying on, But in the Shango Baptist or the Jumper church's home in the Caribbean, spirit possession is routine. Isn't that interesting though? Right? It's rare to see spirit possession in one of these Roman Catholic or Anglican churches. And when you do, like I say, you tend to side-eye these people. But in the Shango Baptist, the Jumper churches, not a problem. It's interesting. But how many of you have witnessed it, or how many of you have personally experienced it? I'd be curious to hear about that. The possession of the faithful by spiritual beings is the ultimate sacramental expression in the African cults of Haiti, Cuba, Brazil, and Trinidad, as well as in Black Christian churches in New York, Chicago, Oakland, and especially in the southern United States. So again, having lived in New York for a while now, to me, having lived in America for a while now, to me, like that kind of possession type stuff, to me, that's like more Southern America than say Northern America or Northeast America. It's strange. Mr. Untouchable is here. Mr. Untouchable is in the chat. He says, I witnessed it in church many times, but I'm understanding what I was seeing. African retentions of spirituality. Yeah, that's the thing we did not understand. Mr. Untouchable, I don't know what denomination you grew up in. I'd be curious to hear. But, it just shows you the indoctrination, right? If you came up in an Anglican or / Roman Catholic setting, you side-eyed an African doing that, right? Because it just wasn't, the norm for that religion. But you go outside of that to systems closer to, if not right in the center of African spiritual systems. And that's commonplace, right? The fact that it was happening in the Anglican church when I was growing up is a testament to, so Mr. Untouchable says he's Baptist. Okay, I get it. Yeah, you would have seen it, right? But in the Anglican church, the fact that you could see it, to me, says something about the power of spirituality within African folks, even Africans in the diaspora, right? And that for whatever reason, that person was reactivated, right, in that moment to have an African spiritual outburst, if you will, right? That's very interesting. Like, we know this stuff. We know this stuff deep down inside, but we don't practice it. We don't put ourselves in a position to understand it deeper. So it's very funny to me to look back on that stuff. Mr. Untouchable says, I also remember it was frowned upon by some denominations. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In discussing the phenomenon of spirit possession, it is important to distinguish between the behavioral and the cultural meanings of the state. Behavioral manifestation of spirit possession consists of a trance state in which the subject conducts him or herself in an uncharacteristic manner, reflecting changes in physiological and psychological functioning and state of consciousness, right? The term spirit possession actually refers to the society's definition and interpretation of the content and meaning of the trance state. Behaviorally, possession is a form of altered state of consciousness. On the cultural level, the concept of spirit possession defines, in Wallace's words, any native theory which explains any event of human behavior as being the result of the physical presence in the human body of an alien spirit which takes control of the host's executive functions, most frequently speech, and control of the skeletal musculature. And he said that back in 1959. Ludwig, in a study of altered states of consciousness as a general category of behavior involving experiences beyond normal waking consciousness, cites several characteristics that are meaningful in the context of the phenomenon of ceremonial spirit possession in Africa and Afro-America. So there's some bullet points: alteration in thinking, inward shift in direction of attention, loss of control, greater control or truth may be gained through loss of consciousness control. For example, identity with source of greater power. Change in emotional expression, less control, inhibition, more extreme emotions may be detached. Body image changes, disillusion of boundaries between self and others or universe, feeling of oneness or transcendence. Let's put aside religion for a second, and let's just speak about being. Have you guys ever felt that the boundaries between you and the universe were done away with? Have you ever had that moment where you just felt one with the universe? And what were you doing when you had that moment of feeling one with the universe? I'll be curious to hear what you guys who are here live with me, if this has ever happened for you. I'll be curious to hear, what were you doing? What were you thinking about? What was that feeling of oneness with the universe like? You know, these are things we got to talk about more too as African folks. We got to talk about this stuff, because in talking about it, you might help prepare someone for their journey towards this feeling of oneness or transcendence, right? The next bullet point is change in meaning or significance, which is increased meaning or significance attached to subjective experiences or ideas, perceptions. In such a state are often feelings of profound truth, insight, illumination. This feeling of increased significance or importance is one of the most important features of religious or mystical consciousness, and is probably a major feature in stabilizing many religious groups. Next bullet point, sense of ineffable. Because unique subjective experience, hard to communicate nature or essence to one who has not undergone it, tendency not to remember. So that's why I kind of asked that question before too. When you've transcended in this way, right? When you've connected spiritually in this way, you know, this oneness, do you know what's happening? Do you remember? You know, that stuff. I mean, I would really like to sit down and speak with someone, right? And speak with someone who's doing this on an African spirituality level, not a Catholicism or you know whatever it is, but really speak to someone who's a practitioner, practicing African spirituality, and reach these levels, that avatar state, so to speak. And if you know, you know, right? Mr. Untouchable says, yes, I had that experience. I was at work and it was like a paradigm shifting underneath me. Man, I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that in the chat there. Post some more thoughts on what you experienced so that we can get a better idea, paint a better picture for us. That's dope. You know, and if anyone else has that experience, you know, let us know. By the way, if you're here right now listening to me, make sure to hit the like button. If you can hear my voice, whether it's live right now on this live stream or in the playback, hit the like button, you know. Share the video with you on your social media, you know, etc. So the next one is sense of ineffable. Because unique subjective experience, it's hard to communicate nature or essence to one who has not undergone it, tendency not to remember. So they just repeated something here. The next bullet point is feelings of rejuvenation, renewed hope. Mr. Untouchable, did you feel that way as well? That rejuvenation, that renewed hope, when that paradigm shift occurred underneath you, did you feel renewed? You know, Mr. Untouchable says we'll do it on the weekend when we have time. All right, we'll do it we'll talk about it during Shoot the Breeze. All right, we'll talk about it more during Shoot the Breeze. Make sure you guys tune in on Saturday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. On this platform, we do a Saturday night Shoot the Breeze, if you didn't know, where we talk about topics that listeners who follow the show, who support, they post up topics they like to discuss as a family, as a group. And they do that on the Discord. If you look in the description, you'll see a link. You can join our Discord server. On the Discord, you'll find books and different conversations going on. A lot of information is there, but there's also a space for you to post your Shoot the Breeze topics as well. So if you have an interesting topic that affects Black people, Black equals African people around the world, or wherever you may be, post a topic. Let's talk about it. So to continue, a comparative case study of altered states of consciousness emphasizes the importance of the cultural definition of the meaning of the experience in determining exactly how it is lived by the individual. Wallace, in 1959, observed the effects on two groups of people of ingesting the hallucinogen peyote. One, peyote was something the Amerindians in America used to deal in heavy. One group observed was composed of white Americans for whom taking peyote had no positive cultural defined meaning, but was a purely individualistic experience. The only general meaning their culture gave to such an experience was a negative one, militating against the loss of the individual's usual cognitive orientation and sense of rational control. Members of this group, after ingesting peyote, experienced extreme mood shifts from agitated depression to euphoria to anxiety, and exhibited behavior evidencing a breakdown in social inhibition allowing for shameless sexual and aggressive conduct. The subjects were suspicious of those around them and felt unwelcome feelings of loss of contact with reality, depersonalization, and meaninglessness. They experienced hallucinations, idiosyncratic in content, and felt no therapeutic effects. The other group was composed of Native Americans. Remember I said Native Americans is the deal in peyote? The other group was composed of Native Americans from the Native American Church, the supreme sacrament of which involves taking peyote in a communal ceremonial setting in order to enter into contact with a higher spiritual reality. The peyote is ingested during solemn religious ritual, and communicants hope for personal salvation, of which having a vision is evidence. The Native American experiences under the influence of the peyote contrasted starkly with the largely negative experiences of the whites. The Native Americans had the culturally appropriate experiences for an act of spiritual communion in their society. So there's a couple bullet points here. Initial stability of mood, followed by religious enthusiasm and anxiety, with a tendency toward feelings of religious reverence and personal satisfaction when a vision was achieved, and often expectations of relief from physical illness. Next bullet point is maintenance of orderly and proper behavior, revivalistic enthusiasm, socially proper in this context. The next bullet point is welcome feelings of contact with a new, more meaningful, higher order of reality, but a reality prefigured in their doctrinal knowledge and implying more rather than less social participation. Next bullet point, hallucinations, religious visions that is, often strongly patterned after doctrinal models. Next bullet point, marked therapeutic benefits and behavioral changes, reduction of anxiety level, increased sense of personal worth, more satisfaction in community life. So let me just say something about this right here. I posted a tweet a little while ago talking about religion and the Abrahamic religions and why, sitting up here debating about it and trying to show people that it's just a colonizer's tool. While that is true and it makes a whole bunch of sense, it really comes down to thrill. You're not going to take away people's thrill unless you're about to replace it with a greater thrill. You feel me? And so when you hear religious people talk about what it is to be a believer, so to speak, a quote unquote believer, right? They say things just like what I just read. You know, anxiety gone, depression gone, increased sense of personal worth and more satisfaction, walking through the world. When the reality is they really put on blinders to the world at large. And they just focus their tunnel vision on this religious thing. But that's a thrill that they have. That's their thrill. If you're not going to replace that thrill, it kind of doesn't even make sense talking about it. And I know that religion thing is a big impediment for African progress, for nation building. I get it. But what I'm trying to really say is create a greater thrill. That's the objective. Create a greater thrill. If you ever notice something, when religious people fall out of religion, they usually go hardcore into something else. It's the same thing with a person who was on drugs. Like I knew someone who was on crack. And when they beat the addiction, if you observe them closely, you'll notice that they're chain smoking, or they're drinking beers back to back to back, or what have you. They replace that thrill with another thrill. It might not be greater, might not be as thrilling, but it's something to replace what they lost. And that's what you have to do. I think that's the main thing. And so when, like Onitase made the point before, although I haven't come across it, but I think I saw him mention it again recently, and he said it was the wife who said it. Marcus Garvey, for all intents and purposes, is a staunch Roman Catholic. But it's been said that, and apparently maybe his wife said it, it's been said that he used it as a what's the word I'm trying to find? Basically he took it for what it was, and he met people where they were. It was a tactic, right? So the tactic that we got to come up with, how do we replace this dependence on this thing, this thrill that they get? How do we replace it with a thrill, so to speak, of our own? To continue, altered states of consciousness of various sorts exist in all societies, but some societies define them as outside of the realm of accepted behavior, thus as involuntary, undesirable, pathological, and something to cure or otherwise eliminate. The worldview of the African and Afro-American societies in question is such that the altered state of consciousness manifests in the act of spirit possession is highly desirable and ardently sought. The basis of this worldview is the humanoid character of the possessing deities and their very intimate involvement in the lives of humans. The spiritual beings in the Yoruba and Fon pantheons, known respectively as Orishas and Laos in Brazil and Haiti, the Afro-American societies in which the African religions have remained most intact, are mostly deities of natural phenomena. Mythology reveals their very human characters. They marry, have children, quarrel, have distinct likes and dislikes in areas such as color, food, and drink, and have kinship relationships among themselves. In Brazil, Oxóssi, Orisha of hunting, and Ogun, Orisha of iron, are brothers, and Yansan, Orisha of storms, and Oshun, Orisha of fresh water, are wives of Shango. Orisha of thunder, so Shango's of Shango, Orisha of thunder, sorry. The spiritual beings live in the environment around their devotees and like to come among them to dance and eat and drink their favorite dishes and beverages. They come into the human community by incarnating themselves in some of its members. The incarnate gods then interact with each other and with the members of the community who are not possessed. The mechanism of spirit possession as defined in these societies involves the displacement of the deity of one of the constituent parts of the individual's personality, the one responsible for the person's will and executive functions. The individual is no longer considered to be him or herself, but has become the god. In fact, the possessed individual is not even considered to be present, since his or her normal personality and behavior have been replaced by that of the Orisha or Lao. The individual does not remember the possession experience, and people talk of the presence and behavior of a particular spiritual being at a ceremony without mentioning the person who incarnated him or her. Thus, the identity between human and superhuman is complete. In the ceremonial setting, there is a priest or priestess who presides, invoking and sending away the deities and controlling their behavior while they are present. The priest or priestess has usually female assistants who do not get possessed, but who act as attendants to the people who do. Crucial role is played by the three drummers, because it is the drums that call the Orishas and Loas. Am I pronouncing that right? Loas? You guys let me know. To earth. Each deity has his or her own drum rhythm and will only come when it is played. When it ceases, he or she will go away. When new rhythm is played, another Orisha or Loa comes to dance in the person of his or her devotee. You know, I guess I could ask this question here too, of the pro-black perspective. That's the only thing I'd say. When you were in Ghana, did you experience acts of African spirituality? Did you personally partake in any, or did you witness any? I'm curious to know what you saw as far as spirituality and religion goes, or did you just see people going to church on Sunday? You know, I'm curious to know. We'll tune back into the chat in a second to hear to see what Oni has to say. Those persons who become possessed have usually undergone an initiation ceremony that may have lasted from a period of many months or even years in the most traditional African cults to a period of weeks or even days in the Afro-American cults. The initiation is seen as a symbolic death, as a profane person, and a rebirth as a sanctified person who participates in the nature of the gods. I gotta tell you, just reading this is more interesting to me. Just reading this is way more interesting to me than all the years I grew up in the Anglican Church. How about you guys? Right? In some traditional African cults, there was considered to be such discontinuity between the pre- and post-initiation identity of the person that he or she was given a new name. During the initiation, the individual learns all about the Orishas or Loas. The initiate learns about his or her personal, hold on, we got to come to that note, his or her personal Orishas or Loas history, habits, likes, and dislikes, what he or she requires of the devotee by way of offerings, and how to dance as the deity when the drums call. A small hole is made in the person's head a small hole is made in the person's head into which is put a substance associated with the spiritual being to whom the individual is dedicated. I did not know that. That's new to me. In Haiti and Brazil, the individual's principal deity is called, quote unquote, master of the head. Periodic individual ceremonies are held to allow each devotee to take care of his or her head, to strengthen and reinforce the presence of the deity in the person. Okay. Before we continue that, let me just go back to this kind of a footnote here about the Loas. While attending a candomblé ceremony in the state of Bahia in Brazil, I asked if I could take photographs. I was granted permission to photograph the dancers, but not the Orishas. When these same dancers became possessed, I was not to take pictures of the Orishas whom they had become. Interesting. So just to continue where I left off, thus the initiate actually has some God substance in his or her head. And as a result of the initiation, learns the cues that bring the deity into his or her human receptacle. The ceremony starts, the drummers call and salute the deities, and the drums become, in the words of Verger, speaking of Brazil, quote, a sonorous imperative in which the Orisha demands the body of his devotee, in which to manifest himself, end of quote. Bastidi says, the African gods only live in the measure to which they are reincarnated in the flesh of their devotees. So the actual rite of possession is the supreme and most dramatic moment of the religious ceremony. Okay, just trying to highlight this. Other scholars who have studied these Afro-American religions in the various societies in which they exist comment on the total individual and group participation fundamental to this common religious style. Referring to Haitian Voodoo, Mabille says the fundamental character of possession is the total participation of the devotees. They are not just spiritually uplifted, as in Christianity, but their entire beings are put into motion. The sacred rhythms of the drums reach the depths of their being and make them the playthings of the gods who possess them. So earlier I was talking about my own experience growing up in an Anglican church. And one of the things that I would notice through the years, especially as I became a teenager, is people defected. And you guys are familiar with the Roman Catholic / Anglican style of, religious proceedings. It's very mundane, right? And a lot of people used to, especially youth, I remember at one point, a lot of youth were exiting the Anglican church. And they were going to what we call the Jumper Church, which is a Baptist church home. Because it was more electric. Like when you spoke to these folks, they'll tell you, way more electric, similar to what this writing just said just now. Their whole beings were moved when they went to, the Jumper Church, right? There was something greater in that experience. And I'm realizing as I, the more time I've been distanced from that stuff, I realize that it's because of who we are, man. It's because of who we are. That mundane stuff that we see in these European religions, that's not us, man. That's not us. We can't vibrate. We can't vibrate the way we're supposed to in those things. This is why we got to get back. We got to get back to what we originally did as best we can, right? As best we can. The sacred rhythm of the drums reach the depths of their being and make them the playthings of the gods who possess them. That's powerful. I much prefer to be involved in something like that than in the mundane Euro religions that were pushed upon us. Thus, the act of worship is a communal experience in which supernatural beings mingle with humans. Some individuals are so totally involved, body and soul, as to entirely lose themselves in the meaning of the event, and in doing so give meaning to the event. A number of scholars have compared this style of worship, which demands total involvement on all levels by participants, with Western forms that call for greater reserve and detachment. Mars wrote that Western mysticism is individualistic, calm, contemplative, and Apollonian. Much primitive mysticism, on the other hand, tends to be gregarious, based on collective enthusiasm and Dionysian, right? Bacchus, Dionysus. Ravenscroft commented that in such primitive religious ceremonies, all factors combine to produce dramatic social atmosphere and mentality which redefines reality. Individual thoughts and feelings are transcended by collective action and sentiment, and individual attention changes to collective preoccupation. Group thought focuses on the principle of the god or gods being served, and the secular world is forgotten. Secular world is forgotten. Unfortunately, it's too much of that when black folks practice these Europeans' religions, right? Commenting on the total individual and community involvement in these societies and distinguishing such behavior from the type appropriate to most Western religious orientations, De Huche says, in each religion, dialogue with the gods calls for specific corporal techniques. Much Christian worship is characterized by humility, effacement, and the silence of the body. The activity of the body is suspended in conformity to the dualistic metaphysic, which separates mind and body and condemns the body to effacement as the mind communes with God. Any disorganization of the senses in communication with the sacred is of diabolical origin. Mystics communicating with God in an unorthodox manner are considered aberrant. The Christian bodily techniques are opposed point for point to those of the possession cults of the African and Afro-American cults in question. Bastide, viewing spirit possession within the larger framework of the fundamental goals of religion, says, referring to Brazil, what characterizes a religion, whatever kind it might be, is the establishment of a contact between the world of men and the world of the sacred, that of the gods and supernatural forces. But if in Western religions it is man who, with difficulty, by means of a usually painful effort, manages to elevate himself to God, in the so-called primitive religions, it is the deities who descend and come for a few minutes to inhabit the bodies of their faithful ones. The nucleus of Afro-Brazilian religions is, then, this entrance of the Orisha into the organism, into the head, into the muscles. It is the fall of the saints, come from ancestral Africa to the sanctuaries of Bahia or of Pernambuco. I don't know what that is. Right? Let me just tap back in with the chat. See what's going on there. KW Don 7 is here saying Sawubona. Greetings and peace to KW Don 7, always faithful. The pro-black perspective says, I was in the city, so just churchgoers, unfortunately. Okay. Mr. Untouchable says, yes, you're pronouncing it right. The Haitians say Lua, LWA, but when you anglicize it, it sounds like Loas. Okay. The pro-black perspective says a few Muslims, but if I went to village, I might have seen something more traditional. I wasn't sure what kind of accommodations they had. I get you. I understand. And by the way, only to say from the pro-black perspective, like I tell you guys, make sure to check out his last episode because he talks about his trip and food that he ate. And in the chat, we had like these side conversations about how like, some of that stuff is, you can see that in the Caribbean like today, So make sure to check it out. But yeah, I definitely want to talk to Onita Say too about arrangements to hit Ghana, like suggestions, right? So I do look forward to having that conversation one day. Mr. Untouchable says there's a famous African-American writer that did a book on Haitian spirituality. Her name is Zora Neale Hurston, and the book is Tell My Horse. Mr. Untouchable, I talk about Zora Neale Hurston before in the past, and I talk about, I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of her stories were taken from the Bahamas, actually. If you read some of her work, you'll actually hear her talking about her time in Nassau and stuff like that. So it's interesting. That hoodoo and stuff, a lot of stuff she was talking about, she was witnessing Bahamians who were practicing that stuff. It's very interesting. You should check that out. Afrojam says syncretism is a corruption of African culture. Absolutely. Absolutely. We gotta get the alien out of the native stuff. We gotta get it out of there. Nefere is here. Wow, I haven't seen Nefere in a long time. Greetings, sis. Nefere says greetings. Y'all say greetings back to Nefere. She's talking to all of us. She's greeting everyone. Y'all say what's up. Uabantuum number 2 is here. Uabantuum says to Mr. Untouchable, Zora Neale Hurston was based in Jacksonville, Florida for a while. She researched hoodoo quite a bit. Mr. Untouchable says, she did work on that too in her later work. He also says, yes, she was in the Bahamas. Afrojam says the Bahamas and Florida are connected. Yeah, there's a connection there. If you go, in fact, before the ADOS, FBA stuff, most black folks in America generally understood that Bahamians really built Miami. It was a general understanding like, Bahamians really did that stuff. But now, of course, all that's been topsy-turvy. And Afrojam is correct. He says people move back and forth periodically. Yeah, the Bahamas was actually a part of, I want to say was a part of the Underground Railroad. I can't think of the name properly. But I forget the name. I forget what it was called. But a lot of the enslaved who ran away made their way down to the Bahamas and Haiti, etc. So yeah. To continue though, actually, you know what? Let me do a station ID break, and we'll be back on the other side to continue the paper.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the Revolutionary Matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Y'all make sure to check out all those other shows on KWAZ Radio. Afro Jam said something there too about geography. A lot of people say that, but the reality of it is, when you look at the southerly part islands of the Bahamas, they're right. You could see Haiti on some clear days. So I don't get involved in that whole geographic, that whole technical geographic thing, because when you look at the culture is definitely a Caribbean culture. I see we have more people have tuned in tonight. Chaka says we in here. I appreciate you on African time, of course. But you guys make sure to hit the like button, man, while you're here. Right? Afro Jam says it was for most of enslavement. Canada was for a much shorter time. Florida was claimed by the Spanish, but they didn't have many boots on the ground. You talking about the Underground Railroad. Mr. Untouchable just says to Afro Jam, maybe not geographically. And again, I question that geographic thing too, to be honest. But culturally, definitely. Right? To continue though, I want to thank all of you guys who tuned in tonight. I appreciate all of you for being here. Commenting on the total individual and community involvement in these societies and distinguishing such behavior from the type. Am I in the right place? No, I'm sorry. In the spirit of possession ceremonies, members of human societies thus establish a kind of rapport with their deities that does not take place in most religions, right? The supernatural entities representing the forces of nature temporarily become members of the human community, and people can interact with them intimately and informally, gaining greater understanding of the forces controlling their lives through this intimacy. Normal structures and characterizations of everyday reality are put into abeyance. The distinction between humans and deities no longer exists. Man and his deities are now, in a sense, on the same plane. The possession ceremony obliterates the line between natural and supernatural, sacred and profane, as men and gods are fused in the possession phenomenon. Man is elevated to a divine plane because he incarnates the gods and interacts with them. The gods incarnate are treated with both respect as gods to be supplicated and banter as equals or as deities who have come to enjoy themselves in a very human manner. In communicating with the gods in this manner, the humans can feel a sense of security because they are in direct contact with the powers that control their lives. They are taking active and positive steps to ensure the well-being of individuals and the community by this collective evoking of the gods. Walker, 1972. Even those people who do not become possessed by the Orishas or Loas participate in their glory and power through direct and close interaction with them in the new social dynamic that develops for the occasion. Social distinctions between people are erased, as are even those between oneself and others to some degree, as all high and low are transferred from the level of ordinary human interaction to the level of supernatural interaction. During this sacred period, with all normal structure in abeyance, the individuals lose their normal identities. People who are structurally powerless and inferior socially are in their glory because they may bring great benefits to the community by personifying and pleasing the gods. The most striking feature here is the intimate tangible relationship between humans and deities. In the United States, some elderly black people will say matter-of-factly, quote, "I was talking with Jesus," end of quote, as if he were a familiar neighbor. And in Haiti, devotees may be, quote unquote, married to certain loas. Thus, the supernatural is experienced as a normal part of everyday reality. This palpable relationship between people and their deities is a unifying feature of the Africa to Afro-America religious continuum. The precise forms in which this relationship is expressed varying somewhat from one Afro-American society to another. In fact, if the deities do not descend to earth to participate in the ceremonies, if the devotees do not experience a supernatural presence within their bodies, no religious experience exists. No ceremony can take place in the absence of all of the key participants, and there is no abstract way in which the deities may be present in these Afro-American religions. They must become part of immediate, tangible, social reality. Of this relationship as manifest in the United States, where the Africanity of black religion is much less obvious than in Brazil and Haiti, Wilmore says the essential ingredient of black Christianity prior to the Civil War was the creative spirituality of the African religions. The defining characteristic of that spirituality was its spontaneous fascination with an unself-conscious response to the reality of the spiritual world and the intersection between that world and the world of objective perception. The African religions brought to the Americas by the slaves had to be adapted to the radically different conditions of socio-cultural and political control to which black people were subjected in the Americas. In some areas, the religions of the Afro-American populations have succeeded in remaining more visibly African than in others due to differing historical factors. Because of both varying slave policies and dominant religious orientation of the local whites, three basic patterns of accommodation of the African religions to the new realities occurred. It is in Brazil, in the most traditional candomblés in the state of Bahia, that the transplanted African religion has retained its greatest authenticity to the extent that Yoruba scholars have visited Bahia to study aspects of their religion that continue to exist there that no longer exist in Nigeria. That's wild to me. The Aruba Orishas, by and large, retain the same names and identities as in ancestral Africa, and are worshipped in very similar ways to the same drum rhythms. Worship is led by a priest or priestess, the Babalo, Babalo Orisha or Mamalo Orisha, the same terms by which they are known in Nigeria. Many Yoruba words are used in religious practice, liturgy, and song. How many of you who are alive here today have experienced one of these ceremonies in person? Right? How many of you have experienced that have experienced, one of these kind of ceremonies? I see Afro Jam is on this Bahamas thing heavy. But whatever. The point is that the culture is Caribbean, and that's all that really matters. But how many of you have experienced it personally? I'm curious to know. Several factors contributed to allowing Afro-Brazilians to retain their African religion in a relatively pure form. The slave policy in the northeastern states of Bahia and Pernambuco, where the Africans were concentrated, was to keep slaves from the same ethnic group together, a practice contrary to that used in the United States. The purpose for keeping slaves from the same group together was not humanitarian in inspiration. On the contrary, the rationale was that such a practice should ensure that slaves from different groups remain conscious of their own specific ethnic identity, and that they not lose sight of traditional differences from and antagonisms toward other ethnic groups with whom they now shared a common plight, so as to decrease the risk of developing a common and unified Afro-Brazilian consciousness. That's real interesting. That's really interesting. In addition, the slave trade continued more than a generation longer in Brazil than in the U.S., and many Yoruba slaves were imported toward the end of the slave period and concentrated in the urban area of Salvador, capital to the state of Bahia. Thus, people were brought more recently from Africa who could renew and reinforce religious orthodoxy. Consequently, Shango, the Yoruba god of thunder, is worshipped in Brazil in much the same way as he is worshipped in Nigeria. The same is true of Obatala, Ogun, Oye, and the others who retain the same functions, symbols, and preferences that they had in Africa. That's an interesting part of the reading right there, as to why it was retained so heavily and how these bastards who enslaved our ancestors in that part of the world unintentionally did us a solid in that sense, if you will, right? Mr. Untouchable says, I would have to go to Haiti to experience it. Yeah, that's my thinking. Afrojam says South America has people who retain their culture. The Amazon plays a huge part too. Tell us how the Amazon played a part in folks retaining their culture. Was it because of how the Amazon is it like the Gullah Geechee who were in a part of the U.S. where the conditions had it where they were kind of left alone just to be, right? Is that what you're getting at? That the Amazon was, because of how the Amazon is set up, it just allowed for folks to kind of be, you know? There are, of course, features of this religion that are specific to Brazil. There has been intra-African syncretism in that people of different African origins contributed their own beliefs and worship styles to the dominant Yoruba influence. And some candomblé, as the Afro-Brazilian religion is called in Bahia, communities have incorporated influences from the Indian societies indigenous to Brazil. The Yoruba continuity, however, is sufficiently evident that when Pierre Verger in 1957 showed photographs of religious symbols and ceremonies, including people possessed by the gods, to Yoruba villagers in Nigeria, the Africans were convinced that the photographs must have been taken in a neighboring village. Another kind of syncretism also took place in the Afro-Brazilian religious communities, whereas initially the Portuguese had allowed the slaves to practice their religion more or less freely. In the beginning of the 20th century, political authorities, in conjunction with the Catholic Church, outlawed the worship of the African deities. The Afro-Brazilians were to embrace Catholicism. Whereas some people did indeed become Catholic, many managed to remain faithful to their ancestral religion while avoiding persecution by superficially Catholicizing their deities, a practice to which Catholicism lends itself well. The pantheon of Orishas and the roster of saints were found to have traits in common. The Afro-Brazilians very astutely gave each African deity a new name. For example, Omolu or Oba Luya, Orisha of smallpox, was identified with Saint Lazarus. Thus, the Afro-Brazilians could claim to be worshiping the Catholic saints, while in reality worshiping their own Orisha. For example, on the day of the feast of Saint Lazarus, members of the Candomblé may attend services at a Catholic church and then worship Omulu in the traditional way in a Candomblé house in the evening, or may worship Omulu with drums and incidences of possession directly in front of the church within which the celebration for St. Lazarus is taking place. People may use both the Catholic name and the African name, but their understanding of the nature of the deity and the way he or she is worshipped very clearly came from Africa. Cuba is similar to Brazil in its maintenance of the Yoruba cult, known as Lucimi or Santeria, the Spanish name reflecting again the correspondence made between African Orishas and Catholic saints. Haitian Voodoo is quite well known, but known not at all well. The major African ethnic influence in Haiti is Fon, the neighbors of the Yoruba from the nation formerly known as Dahomey and now as Benin. There had historically been much contact and cultural exchange between the two ethnic groups, which was reflected in their religious similarities. Both the pantheons and styles of worship are similar. The deities are known in Fon as Voodoo or Voodoons, also being known in Haiti as Loa. Hold on a second. Also being known as Loa. Once again, the Catholic state religion, with its many saints, allowed an atmosphere hospitable to the African pantheon, and the Haitians were also quick to perceive the similarities. In fact, the two religions were perceived as so compatible in some ways by rural peasants that being Catholic is a prerequisite to being a voodoo devotee. That's interesting. I have never heard that before. Huh. Similarly, in Brazil, an Afro-Brazilian sisterhood, the Irmandade da Boa Morte, celebrates an annual Catholic festival in the town of Cachoeira. Only women initiated into the Candomblé may be members of the sisterhood. You know, that leads to an interesting question that I haven't fully formed the question in my head, but what does it say? I know it was a survival tactic to line up African Orishas with the Catholic Church. I know it was a survival tactic. Again, I haven't fully formed this question. There's a question I have in mind, but I don't know how to deal with it. Hold on one second. Yeah. Yeah, but I'm trying to form this question in my head. You know what? I'll table it for a minute. I'll try to form it while I continue reading. I'll get to the comments in a second in the chat. An interesting phenomenon in Haiti is the multiplication of the deities, the creation of a whole new family of Creole deities, as distinguished from the African deities. These new spiritual beings reflect Haitian historical and social patterns. They are not the masters of the forces of nature like the African gods. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, hero of the Haitian Revolution, is part of this pantheon, as is Urzuli, goddess of love, who manifests the physical features of the socio-cultural defined ideal woman, which do not correspond to the appearance of most peasant women. A mulatto, she speaks French, drinks good rum, and will not interact with Zaka, who is a peasant Loa who drinks cheap rum and speaks Creole. The new set of deities, rather than representing natural forces, represents historical and social structural forces of the environment. A similar phenomenon exists in Brazil in Umbanda, a religion that fuses African and European spiritualist beliefs and practices into a mix much less African in foundation than the candomblé. Some of the uniquely Brazilian spiritual entities of the Umbanda pantheon are Preto Vejo, the old black slave, and Caboclo, the Indian. Are you guys familiar with any of this stuff out of Brazil? So I guess the question I wanted to ask earlier is this. If the Africans were on some survival tactic, as I call it, if they were on some survival tactic of creating this syncretism, when the threat was gone, right? After the threat was gone, do you think there was an effort to revert or to excise the European religion from the African stuff? Or by that time, was it too late? Was it the case that by the time that the in-your-face threat for which you had to, or for which you felt a need to rename African deities with these Catholic ones, right? Just to survive, right? Do you think, number one, do you think anyone tried to reverse it, to revert it back to what it was? And if so, do you think that it was too late? Once you started to join these traditional faiths with this European one, it was just too late. The people were just, generations, new generations came in, and they didn't understand the connection. They didn't understand what was done. Do you think that's what happened? Let me go read some comments in the chat. Afro Jam says South America has people who retain their culture. The Amazon plays a huge part too. Afro Jam says yes, somewhat. They are descendants of Maroon. So that he's responding to my question of, is it because of the Amazon kind of hid them away and allowed them to just be to themselves? And he says yes, because they were descendants of Maroons. Uwa Bantum number two says, in the continent, Christian Islamic schools were established pretending to be benevolent, so a lot of cultural degradation occurred over the centuries. I agree with that. Afrojam says, but it's the Guyanas, Colombia, and Brazil, many towns and villages set up by Maroons. Afrojam goes on to say, this is syncretism that sellouts promote to integrate. This is all lies Euros promote. Afrojam says there are now big branches of African spirituality in Brazil and Venezuela where whites are majority due to syncretism. Interesting. It was not survival. It is a culture of sellout former Maroons. All right, so let's let me put this out there. Afrojam is set to say it wasn't a survival tactic. It was just a sellout tactic. How many of you believe it was a survival tactic or it was just a bunch of sellouts? I'll be curious to hear from you guys. Achieve Mindset is here saying greetings. Achieve Mindset, greetings to you too. The Pro-Black Perspective says, I think 3 generations will erase the memory. That's kind of what I'm thinking, right? That's the danger of doing it in the first place. Once new people are born into the bullshit that you created, they're going to forget. They're going to forget. Afrojam says there are people who never syncretize. Whites are not allowed to document them. Okay. Mr. Untouchable says, Koku, when was the threat gone? These guys codified laws against practicing African religion. If you openly practice it, you still could go to jail, and the new black jailers would put you there. Right? Yeah, so, I mean, when I say when the threat was gone, I mean to say, and this goes back to what Oni said from the pro-black perspective. I mean to say, you're right. There was these codes, there were laws, right? But those laws didn't stand forever. Right? Those laws didn't stand forever. There was a point, at some point, the folks, they were able to commandeer and create their laws and constitutions, etc., I assume. So I'm saying, like, but again, by the time that occurred, as the pro-black perspective said, the memory is gone. Mr. Untouchable says it was for survival. I'm very careful to be so self-righteous and looking back at history. Afrojam says it didn't exist in Jamaica, but Jamaica had sellout Maroons. Okay. Yeah, I'll be curious to hear from the rest of you. Do you see syncretism as being discussed in this paper? Was it a sellout move or was it a survival move? Right? I'll be curious to hear from you guys on that. In fact, hold on. Let me just put this here in the chat. And you guys can vote on it like a poll. Is syncretism a sellout move? Right? As this conversation as per this conversation. Right? Let's continue. In those areas of the Americas in which the African slaves were subjected to Protestantism rather than Catholicism, they were unable to maintain their polytheistic pantheon. The most extreme case is in the United States, the farthest end of the cultural continuum from Africa. On the Caribbean islands, the Africans were able to retain more of their culture and social institutions than in the United States because they were more numerous than the whites and lived in greater concentration and isolation. In the United States, the policy was to separate Africans from the same area so that the slaves would not be able to communicate easily with each other. Thus, by such isolation, precluding both the possibility of insurrection and the transmission of coherent and integrated African traditions to the next generation. In this way, the slaves were expected to become more culturally American as rapidly as possible, or at least less culturally African. And ask yourself why, right? Ask yourself why. Right? Thus, the most African culture that was transmitted in an unattenuated form, adapted to the possibilities, requirements, and constraints of the new environment. Worshipping their own gods was prohibited for the new Afro-Americans in the United States. They were taught Christianity because it was expected to convince them that their slave status was part of a divine plan. As much as you can tell Black equals African folks who practice Christianity, this right here, unless you're going to replace this thrill, as I said earlier in the show, you're not going to do anything with them and that faith. However, although slaves in the United States had to leave their African gods behind, they did not leave behind their sense of religion, of what should be the nature of interaction between human and deity, and how a deity should be properly worshipped. They understood the new religion within the framework of the old, and it is this framework that has set the pattern for the black religions experienced in the United States, as evidenced in traditional black Baptist, Methodist, and Pentecostal churches. Thus, names like African Methodist Episcopal Church and First African Baptist Church refer to more than just the pigmentation of their members. As black people have become more integrated into American culture, many have moved away from this form of religious experience as they have from other cultural institutions that are African in origin. The Protestant Church did not allow the accommodation of the African deities as did Catholicism, with its many saints, so the slaves carried over their style of understanding and worshiping to the one God they learned about in this church. Of this phenomenon, Mitchell, who sees black Christianity as firmly and clearly rooted in traditional African religious forms, asserts that the phenomenon of spirit possession is almost universal in black mass-oriented churches. Mitchell further states that blacks evolved an understanding that the plurality of beings which had formerly possessed them were in fact only one. And this one was none other than the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit or Holy Ghost. If one looks at any one of thousands of Baptist, Methodist, or Pentecostal churches, the survival and adaptation of this strong African possession tradition to African purposes is obvious. The synthesis of African and Christian influences was a sound and lasting metamorphosis early accomplished in the American colonies. Those who had been healingly possessed by a variety of deities were now overshadowed by the one but true in God, in his person as Holy Ghost or Holy Spirit. The music and speech which once induced possession were quite similar to the rhythm, the rhythm, repetition, and mass hypnotic phenomena which accompany much of Black American shouting even today. The great strength of Black Christianity is that in its worship, it never abandoned the holism of the African tradition, nor bowed the knee of conformity to sterile white canons of religious expression. I disagree with that. What say you guys? Right? I disagree with that. I disagree with that, but what say you guys in the chat? Right? I see in the chat, Mr. Untouchable said something interesting. He said to me, practicing obeah is still illegal in the Bahamas. It's still on the books, bro. Check it out. I never doubted that at all. I never doubted that at all. That's one of my big problems with the hometown. I'll talk about that maybe during Shoot the Breeze, actually. My big problems with the hometown. Afro Jam says they still speak their own language and don't share the culture or language with regular Jamaicans. They protect their own culture still. Afro Jam says it's illegal in Jamaica too. You can't stop it though. Afro Jam, where are you from? Out of curiosity, are you from Jamaica? Where are you from? Are you from Guyana or Brazil or something? Where are you from, Afro Jam? I think I may have asked you that before. Forgive me if I did, and I'm forgetting right now. But yeah, there's a reason why that stuff is illegal, though. And that's the thing that we have to... That's the thing that we have to start pushing back against. Right? Where was I? The process of synthesizing African understandings and styles into the practice of Afro-American Protestantism is more explicitly evident in some areas outside of the United States in which African cults exist. In Trinidad, for example, some people leave the Shango cult and join the Protestant church. There, rather than being possessed by Shango, they may be filled with the Holy Ghost. Felipe notes that in Haiti, the major reason for the attraction of the Église de Dieu Pentecost is its perceived similarity to Voodoo. Being filled with the Holy Spirit resembles possession by the lower in the Voodoo religion, and a kind of Protestant Voodoo syncretism exists. Right. So I didn't show earlier photos, but this is a photo apparently of people being possessed by an Orisha in Brazil. Right. And again, this looks just like Shango Baptist type stuff. Right. Members of the congregation in the Pentecostal church hold hands and greet each other in the same way as in Voodoo services, each with one arm around the other's neck and the other meeting above their heads to form an arch. I didn't even know that. Is that true in the Pentecostal church? I didn't even know that. Let me look that up. Huh. You learned something. She reports having seen a worshiper filled with the Holy Ghost cry, I'm going to butcher this. I apologize to anyone. Ki kuiu gau, at which point a voodoo cult member asks if the person were possessed by a gue, lower of the sea, particularly since his motor behavior was also strikingly similar to that of a person possessed by Ogue. In the United States, in the absence of actual African religions, the relationship between traditional Afro-American Protestantism and its African roots is not as obvious, but a knowledge of the structure and philosophy of the Yoruba and Fawn possession cults and the forms they take in other New World African societies allows one to perceive similar patterns in spite of the transformations. The most significant cultural carryover is reflected in those moments when the rhythmic gospel songs and the hypnotic preaching of the minister call the Holy Ghost to enter into the bodies of the worshipers, just as the drums call the African gods to enter the heads of their worshipers in Nigeria and Benin and Brazil and Haiti. The Afro-American preacher orchestrates the ceremony, raising religious feelings to a high pitch receptive to the coming of the Holy Ghost, or cooling them down just as the African, Afro-Brazilian, or Haitian priests or priestesses calls and sends away the Orisha, Voodoo, or Loa. In both ceremonial situations, there is a sentiment of community, support, and special people are designated to watch over those who have received the Spirit. All right? If you want to replace that thrill, you have to give them these type of things right here. In both instances, receiving the Holy Ghost or the Orisha or the Voodoo or the Loa is, in Bastide's words, quote, the supreme moment, the culmination of religious ceremony, and the moment in which the faith of the devotees is most intensely expressed, end of quote. Both the Holy Ghost and the African gods dance in the persons of their devotees, often giving them a physical agility that they might be hard put to manifest under more usual circumstances. Both also speak through their devotees, in the one case speaking in unknown tongues, characteristic of Pentecostals, and in the other speaking what is said to be an esoteric African language that only trained priests and priestesses can interpret. In both cases, feelings of insight, renewal, and increased well-being follow. In both cases, feelings of insight, renewal, and increased well-being follow. In both cases, in Duvignon's words, the human and the divine intersect, and man transcends his humanity. In this experience, the frontiers between natural and supernatural no longer exist. Ecstasy has made the desired communion a reality. Thus, although the Orisha, the Voodoos, and the Loa have found no devotees in United States Protestantism, Afro-Americans have created a style of Protestantism that conforms to a culturally transmitted worldview predicated on the possibility and desirability of experiencing a reality beyond that of the everyday, and on the intimate nature of the relationship between human and divine. It is these African philosophical orientations that form the basis for Black religions in its various forms, from Africa to the to America. So there's a footnote here that says there have recently been developed neo-Yoruba religious groupings that are reviving the worship of the Orisha in the United States. The best known neo-Yoruba community is currently located in the village of Oyo Tunji, Oyo, a Yoruba kingdom, rises again or is reborn in Shelton, South Carolina, the basis of community being the worship of the Orisha. So that's the end of the paper. Before I go, though, I want to put out the call for KWAZ Radio, which is we're looking to add more podcasters to the family. And one of the type of shows I know I personally would like to see is a show that deals with African spirituality. So if you or someone you know is a practitioner, is an expert in this practice, I think that you or someone that you know should listen to this.
Have you ever considered joining KWAZ Radio? Each of our hosts shares their unique perspective with you. You might have a perspective that needs to be shared. If that's true, hit us up at kwaz.radio@gmail.com. What are you gonna do? What you gonna do?
What are you going to do? So let someone know that you know who's interested. Let them know that we're looking for new podcasters to talk about different topics within Pan-Africanism. Like I said, me personally, I would love to see someone on the network who's talking African spirituality, who's walking us through the process, introducing us to the Orishas, for example, and letting us know what it is we need to do to have this transcendence, this African-inspired transcendence, this African-inspired oneness, right? In the chat, Afrojam says, yes, Jamaica. Afrojam says you can only be possessed by speaking the languages of the deity. If you are speaking in any European language at the time, you can't be possessed. So yeah, that used to be a topic of discussion, even in the Anglican church where I grew up. When some Black folks started to have the spirit, as we'd call it, when they started to get the spirit, they start speaking. And the thing I think a lot of people never understood was that when you speak in tongues, it's a known tongue. It's just not a tongue that's known to you, the speaker, right? So if you speak in, like Afrojam said, you speak in some European language or gibberish, you're questionable to me, at least. I don't know how you guys feel about it, but you're questionable. You're supposed to be speaking a known tongue that's unknown to you. Afrojam also says Afro-Cubans who retain their true culture have transmitted some of this culture in the United States with African Americans. Okay, I can see that too. I want to thank you guys for being here. I want to thank you guys for being here tonight. I want to particularly thank you guys for all the comments in the chat. I know a lot of you reached kind of late, but all the comments in the chat were wonderful. Thanks to Mr. Untouchable, Afro Jam, the Pro-Black Perspective. Who else was here? Uwa Bantuum, the Chief Mindset stopped by. M. Chaka was in here. The Learning Curve, that's the Revolutionary Matron was here as well earlier. I appreciate you guys for coming through, adding your commentary, which always makes these broadcasts much better. And I put a poll up a few minutes ago while I was talking that says, is syncretism a sellout move? And it got 8 votes, which is pretty dope. Thank you guys for voting. And 25% of the people said yes, sellout move. 75% of the people said no. Right? I'm going to post a similar question to this on the community tab sometime tomorrow, if not later tonight. You guys can also respond to that poll, because there's a couple thoughts that I've had while reading this paper that I think it'll be cool to see what you guys think about it as it relates to syncretism. So we'll have that post up at least by tomorrow afternoon. Again, thank you all for being here with me. I'll be back on Saturday night, Shoot the Breeze. We'll talk about some of the things we discussed here about spirit possession. We'll talk about how obia is illegal in many parts of the Caribbean, not just the 2 countries named. And we'll talk about whatever else you guys post on the Discord. Go to the Discord. The link is in the description. It's at the top of the chat. Go to the Discord. Join today. Find the Shoot the Breeze category. Leave your prompts, the topics you like to discuss for Saturday. Leave it there, and we'll talk about it then. All right, guys. Make sure you guys support all the other hosts on KWAZ Radio. One of the ways you can do it is to check out the merch store that the Revolutionary Matron put together for us. Check out the merch store. Buy a t-shirt. Whoever you like, or if you like everyone, buy a t-shirt from every show. We have more designs coming. There's a variety of colors, so you'll see more designs with the variety of colors coming soon. So don't worry about it. Make sure, check it out today. The Pro-Black Perspective says good reading. Thanks for that. I appreciate when you guys appreciate the reading. Hopefully we can all take something from this and start to do something about it in our own lives. I'll see you guys on Saturday. You guys be good. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.